Okay, so just as kind of a refresher, since it kind of feels like, I mean, we've been disjointed through these last couple of chapters here of times where we've been getting together or not, and then mixing in the men's and ladies things. So um, just as a refresher, 1 Corinthians 7, and basically the last couple of times we've been getting together, we've kind of just been hitting on, as Paul's been dealing with an issue in the Corinthian church of sexual immorality. So he kind of went from sexual immorality and how the church should be dealing with it, and then in First Corinthians chapter 6, or in 5, and then in First Corinthians 6 he talked about how really just um, and they kind of bled in together through 5 and 6, but also just some of the personal ramifications of those things and everything, and just really what it he just laid out some principles of sexual immorality and things. And now we're going to see a transition a little bit in 7 to now talking about sex and some other topics as well, but in regards to marriage, like in its proper bounds and what it should be like, and how husbands and wives should be treating each other and dealing with each other. And then he also just gets into some other principled things. It seems like as we go and study through here, you'll see it. But uh, Paul, they must have been writing back and forth, because Paul starts out in 7 here and he says, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote me." So number one, we found out that he already knew certain things were going on in the church. So somebody's been communicating with Paul, letting him know, like, hey, this is what's going on, and we got some questions about this, whatever it is. So he's dealing with these things. So some of these things are going to be like bullet points, because he's dealing with specific issues that they had wrote to him about, but it continues on in the general theme of everything we've kind of been talking about and just going through stuff. So it'll have a nice flow to it from what we've been talking about. But I believe this is the after we wrap this up, this kind of like closes our little sex talks that we've had, for the past couple of weeks or whatever here. So we get to move on to new topics next week. But that's where we're at, and this is what we're wrapping up with. So just picking up in 1 Corinthians 7, says, "Now concerning the things which you wrote me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due to her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except for a consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this to you as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that." So let's kind of break this down and see what he's going from here. So he starts off with kind of he's saying a principle here. He goes, well, and remember, this is all in light of he's just been dealing with sexual immorality. So this is in that deal, is these people were they were taking it too far, and they were sex outside of marriage, and there was adultery, and there was just the specific instance was one guy was sleeping with his dad's wife, and just crazy stuff going on here. So he starts off and he goes, well, listen, it's good for a man not to touch a woman in light of all those things. He says, but nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Now, is this the only reason you should have a husband or a wife, is because you're just constantly lusting and you can't, stop yourself? So you're like, I just need to get married. No, it's not. But it does play in the factor here too, that he says, listen, you got to understand, like, if you're gonna do it, at least be committed and do it God's way. And so so he comes to say that, and we need to understand that, because this is something. And let me give you a practical thing here too. Listen, there are certain people that can do this, so I'm not making a blanket statement here, but sometimes I wonder, or it can be very tough when you get into some of these long engagements sometimes. You ever meet people that, like, they get engaged and you're like, oh, when do you get married? And they're like, 2 years from now, whatever. And you're like, man, that's interesting, because that's a, like, if the commitment's there, that's a long time to let temptation creep in and to let things go, or whatever, just whatever. So sometimes, like, I think we should be mindful of that. You know what I mean? Even when you're making your decisions, and a lot of times people make those decisions because of personal preferences that really, it's not that big of a deal. Like, I know certain people that, they want to wait till after they graduate, or they want to wait till this, they want to wait till that. And, like, what's the priority? Sometimes is I want to ask the question, you know what I mean? And there are certain circumstances where I understand that happens, and things like that. So again, not a blanket statement, just causing you to think a little bit, let me unduplicate this, because that's like in my side view and kind of creepy. Yeah. Yeah, I was seeing my hand like wave on the TV screen and stuff. So blue's better, except for now I'm like blue, but that's okay. Blue man group over here. So I think it's actually here. There we go. Okay, cool. So, okay, so you know what I'm saying sometimes with this, and I've heard other pastors where, they get together and they have a godly couple, and the couple's together and they want to do things the right way, and they're trying to be pure, and, for whatever reason, they were waiting and waiting and waiting. They set the marriage date for all the way down the road, and they just, man, when two people love each other, that's tough. You know what I mean? So, and listen, I've heard them say, like, if you can't hold it, just get married. You just need to get married. Just do it right. You know what I mean? Like, and a lot of times, sometimes we wait for the wrong things. We want it to be this big, extravagant thing, or we want it to be, the one night that, we just got to have everybody there and everything's got to be in place and all. And listen, it can be nice and that's fine. It's just, what are our priorities here? Like, what are we really thinking of? What are we really working towards? And again, some of the different scenarios, I understand, like, there's those things, and you should, through counsel and things, that's okay. You can have an okay situation to do that, but just make sure you think some of that stuff through, because you don't want to give. It's saying here, like, when you're letting that happen, it's going to be there. That urge and that desire is going to be there. You shouldn't feed it. You should, treat it right. Now, and this is also isn't to say, like, that it might necessarily be right to just go out and get married tomorrow. You know what I mean? Or something like that. But, yeah, you're right. This isn't advocating Vegas either, or something like that. But you know what I'm saying? Just we gotta think about those things. So, were you gonna say something, Ryan? I think you can. I think you can. Yeah, I don't know that there are. There's a lot of traditions and stuff. You like see your fiance will. Yeah, no. But I mean, like, yeah, there are things that can be done that way. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of it, truthfully, when we boil it down and think to it, and I know, listen, I might be hitting a nerve here, because I know it's every little girl's dream to have the biggest wedding and be fancy and awesome and all this kind of stuff, or the typical little girl's dream or whatever, and you know. But there are other ways around, and I'm not saying those things are bad. Like you said, you could even just get married, and then if you wanted to do a big party later, do a big party later. So I don't know. I'm just throwing this out there, because Paul says it's a very real thing that if you continue to let it wait, if you're given to it's because of sexual immorality. That's a big reason that husbands and wives come together. You know what I mean? That, again, not the only reason, obviously. There's so much more to marriage than that, but it factors in, and he's going to continue to talk about it here. So now he transitions and gives about principles for marriage, of sex in marriage, and just even along your relationship. These are things that you can draw into every area. But he says, let the husband render to his wife the affection due to her. So we have to remember that as husbands, we have a responsibility. This doesn't say when she's doing everything right, when the dishes are cleaned, or, you know what I mean, when you come home and the house is cleaned up. It doesn't say when she's, at the top of her A game all the time, or when she's meeting you at the door, you know, like, honey, it's so good to see you. No, it just says, husbands, it's your job to render your wife the affection that's due to her. Okay, like that's your job description. The Bible also talks about loving your wife, for husbands, loving your wife as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He died for the church. He literally, though, one person I heard, he describes it, he says, how did Christ love the church? He entered her world and then died there. And he's like, husbands, that's what you need to enter your wife's world and die there. That's how you love your wife. So it's our job to kind of, you know, put ourselves aside and die for the betterment of our wives. So now the next statement, though, he says, that he didn't finish there. So it wasn't just the husbands. He said, and likewise, the wife is to do the same to the husband. You're going to see a principle here of mutual submission. Okay. A lot of people get like whacked out about how the Bible says, you know, wives submit to your husbands, but they don't read the next verse that says, husbands submit to your wives. But the Bible always teaches mutual submission. Yeah, you want to cherry pick the one part. So, and listen, there's probably guys that are guilty of it just so that they can emasculate, you know, or whatever the word would be, not emasculate. What would you do to, you would dominate women or whatever it is. So I'm sure people have abused that in the past, but you have to understand the Bible doesn't. The Bible teaches mutual submission, that it is the husband's duty and goal to submit to the wife, as much as it's also the wife's duty and goal to submit to the husband. That we should both be looking out for each other's best interests. And we should both be putting each other first. And when you do that, and are you going to be perfect at it all the time? No. But when you do that, it really smooths out a lot of the bumps, because you're not looking in it for what's in it for me. You see, that's what we find a lot of people enter marriage, and they enter marriage with the partner going, this person fulfills me. This person meets my needs. This person completes me. This person they make me feel like nobody else makes me feel, or whatever it is. And it's all about that other person, not necessarily who you are to the equation. If you're going to be, and when you get into that, you're going to have a lot of unmet expectations. That's just the truth. When you come into it trying to get things out of it, if you go to any relationship trying to get something out of the relationship instead of mutually benefiting the relationship, you're going to end up burned and in trouble. You know, and that's in anything, but especially a marriage. I see so many marriages. That's why they always say after 1 or 2 years, it's like the trial by fire or whatever, because half the time people enter into marriage for a certain reason or for a certain feeling or for a certain expectation. And when it's not met, they're disillusioned and they go, oh my gosh, what did I just get into? What am I doing? Like, who is this person I'm now living with? And it's because they came into it with the wrong attitude. It's because they had the wrong expectations. Because on the front end, you didn't really understand what you were doing. And not only that, you probably aren't mutually submitted. Does that make sense? It'd be like Vegas again. Yeah. Doing it for the wrong reasons. Absolutely. And so many people are in that spot. And listen, even people that go into it with the right intentions, sometimes you're going to hit some of that stuff. You're bringing two people. The Bible talks about two people that are unique, that are individuals, that have pasts, that have baggage, that have beautiful things too, but are becoming one. There's a meshing that needs to learn to happen. There's a working together. There's a communication. There's a two becoming one that biblically needs to happen. So of course there's some ups and downs and things along the process, but you need to know the way through that is with Christ at the center and being mutually submissive. That you are each looking out for each other's benefits, not just trying to get what you need out of it for yourself. So, and so continuing on, he says, now here's in verse 4, this is very interesting. He says, now the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And you can't stop there. You can't stop there because, listen, I've heard the same thing. A guy's going to say, well, we need to do this because I have authority over your body and I'm your husband, whatever. Well, read the next sentence. What does the next sentence say? And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Mutual submission. This is an interesting principle, and I want to talk about this a little bit. And I'm going to read on down just to clarify what he's talking about. He says, do not deprive one another. And he's talking about sex here. Do not deprive one another except for consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This is really interesting, because what's the first thing, and I'm just going to say stereotypically, okay? Just, this doesn't mean it's always the case. Stereotypically, when the wife isn't getting treated well, or legitimately, maybe there's something wrong, what does she withhold from her husband? Sex. What does she do? She silent treatments and shells up and says, well, until things get better, no. Well, guess what's a great way to fuel adultery in your household? Or to fuel some improper thoughts, or a place where Satan can get a foothold? That's not even your goal. You're just trying to punish and teach a lesson. Well, guess what? Truthfully, it's not your place to punish and teach a lesson. It's not. Now, don't take this wrong. And this works on the flip side too, guys. And usually, and again, I'm saying stereotypically, listen, there could be guys that they're working too hard, that they're doing all this stuff, and they get home and they're like, I'm just too tired. Sorry, honey, we're good. Or, you know what? Here's more of what it is for women, because guys and girls are men and women are wired differently in this way. For women, usually what I've heard and come to understand, sex begins in the conversations. It's all day. It's the wife feeling loved and connected with you. You know what I mean? So for a guy, this could be just, it's all about the physical, and it's all about, and it's not wanting to talk about the day and how it is. Well, listen, you have to understand, men, that your body and the way you act is not your own, it's your wife's. You need to be thinking her thoughts and meeting her needs. So if you don't feel like talking, but you know your wife does, you need to get over yourself and start talking. Husband, or wives, if you don't necessarily feel like this guy doesn't deserve my love, he doesn't deserve my respect, he doesn't deserve to get lucky tonight, or whatever it is, you need to also think about, am I harming my marriage, or am I trying to punish my husband over something when really I'm creating a very bad scenario? And so you need to talk through these things. And you need to realize too, that this is stuff that we just got to be wise about. And it comes with communication. This is all communication, because this isn't to also say, because it says here, don't withhold yourself from your spouse except for consent. Like if it's mutually consensive, that there are times when you should say, listen, even sex, he says there are times when you should say, we're going to be fasting and seeking God. So in this time, as long as it's mutually, you're on the same page. As long as you're on the same page with it, he says that's a good thing to do. You can do that. But you need to come back together. It should only be for a season. You shouldn't have long times of drought in your sex life, because it's going to give the enemy a foothold. That's what he's saying. So you just need to be wise, wife, to your punishing, quote unquote, of your husband, what you think you're doing, when really you could just be unwisely creating a foothold for the enemy. When really you just might need to work through some of these issues. Maybe you just need to communicate. Maybe you need to even go get some help, or go and listen. Even seeing I'm just saying, and this is for the future for, some of you, a lot of you singles and stuff, but just because you go talk to another couple, or you have a counselor you go see, you don't need to do that when things are bad. You don't need to do that when things are horrible and you're like at your last leg. You should have couples in your life that you guys can come together with and talk, or you should be working in your own marriage to have open lines of communication, that you find out what works for you, But you just got to know this, or guys, like, you got to realize that there are more important things than working and driving yourself nuts, or playing Xbox, or being in every softball league, or whatever it is, that you're depriving your wife times of intimacy that you don't even know it, but you could be creating an area where down the road, right now it might not seem like a big deal, but 3, 6, 9 months down the road, a year down the road, 15 years down the road, sometimes you're going to look at each other and go, I don't even know you anymore. Well, why? It's because all those little decisions you made in the wrong direction back in the day of depriving each other, of not communicating, of coming, not being on the same page and things like that. Does that make sense? So, and he says it's Satan will tempt you, and he says because of your lack of self-control. You have to realize, and we've talked about this a bunch, that's why it says flee sexual immorality, all this. We tend to lack self-control in this area. I mean, some people, as they grow in Christ, they can have it and everything, and it's great. And listen, the goal is to get there, but in a marriage, God has given us sex as a beautiful thing in marriage. Healthy marriages should and can have a lot of sex. You should come together regularly, but you also shouldn't feel guilty either too, because listen, every scenario is different. There are times when kids are in the mix. There's times of seasons in your life when you're busy, or there's stuff going on, or you're just tired, or you're whatever, that as long as you're on the same page, just be aware if there's times of drought in that area, or the fact that, hey, you need to talk about it and just come together, and you might even need to carve it out in your schedule and just say, you know what, no, this is important, because we don't want the enemy to get a foothold here. So even if we're busy, we're carving it out, or even if the kids are crazy and whatever, we're coming together, we're figuring this thing out, because it's important, because this is a place where the enemy can slip in. This is a place where, again, it's subtle, and you might not even think, oh, this isn't a big deal or whatever. But truthfully, you have to remember, your body's not your own. You need to be thinking about your spouse. That's the whole point of this whole section, is you need to be thinking about your spouse. Stop thinking about yourself. It's not just about you anymore. In your sex life, in your life, in your professional life, your family, you have others to think about. You have your spouse to put first. And if she's deprived in an area, or if she's unloved in an area, or feeling inadequate in an area, it's up to you to make it right. And if you have a husband who's feeling deprived in an area, or feeling inadequate in an area, or feeling a lack of respect in an area, it's up for you to make it right. Or else they're going to go looking somewhere else. That's the reality of it. Even some of the best men and women in the world, like seriously, even some of the most godly ones who were trying, to seek the Lord or whatever, who, man, they go to church, they do all this. If left vulnerable, man, we can fall. Each and every one of us can fall. So we just need to be mindful of that. So he says, and he continued on, he goes, this isn't a commandment. I'm not saying this is what has to be done. It's my advice. I think it's very wise counsel for these things. But he says, I wish that all men were even like myself. And Paul, if you follow through the scriptures, there's two views on this. I'll tell you both views. It's interesting because Paul at one point says that he was counted among the Pharisees and the tribunal, that he could cast lots. It says he was there when Stephen was stoned. If you go back to Acts, he was there. And in order to be on the council to cast lots to make a vote in the tribe, the Pharisees, like in the tribe of that, you had to be married. So from that aspect, you see, wow, Paul, it's possible that Paul could have had a wife, but in every other place in the Bible, he talks about being single, and he talks about not having a wife and being like him, by himself. So people are torn. Scholars are torn. Did Paul have a wife and something happened? She passed away. Maybe there was maybe when he became a Christian, she stayed as a Jew, and there was just conflict and they couldn't. So there's all these theories. Or some people just think he was a celibate his entire life and things like that. I'll let you dig deeper if you want to dig deeper into that. Josiah, yeah, he did. Yeah, he could have been a eunuch. Yeah. So all those things. So yeah. Yeah, Josiah, you need to put those away. You're done. Yeah. Okay, so he says each one has his gift from God. So here's the other point you need to look at. Paul looks at it as a gift. So here's the flip side of this for singles too. Some people are gifted to be single. That's a special gifting that the Bible lays out, that there are certain people that will not be married, and sometimes we kind of look down on people at times, as they get up in their 30s or 40s, and we're like, man, I can't believe you don't have a wife yet. Man, I can't believe you don't have a husband yet. Sometimes it's within the will of God for that to be the case. And he even gives some indicators over it, saying things like, and we'll get into it. I won't get into it yet. One of the indicators is if you can't control yourself, like physically, if you're constantly burning with lust, if you're constantly needing that draw from the opposite sex or something, you probably haven't been gifted with singleness by God. That's kind of an indicator there. Okay. So we'll get into that. But he does say that that's a gifting. So don't ever feel bad. There's a place in the church, there's an esteemed place, it shows, in the body of Christ for singleness. And so this is one of the places that gets in certain place. This is, if you ever looked at it and you wondered why the Catholic Church basically says that they don't want their priests to be married or anything like that. This is one of the places that they go and they say, well, Paul said, I wish that you were like me. But if you were going to teach the gospel, then you should be like him and you should be single, wholly devoted to the gospel. Now, you got to also remember, Paul said this was not a commandment. This was not something that the Lord said. And later on in Corinthians, he says, can't we take a wife like Peter had? Peter had a wife. All the other disciples had wives. It was never said, like, if you're going to teach the gospel, do not have a wife. In fact, it actually says you should, if you can't handle being single. So there's abuses on that end. If you think that, you can't be a man of God and have a wife, well, you're wrong there. But if you also think that, somebody who doesn't have a wife can't either, that's wrong as well. So there's a middle ground. It's what God gifts you. And he says so in 8, he says, but to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they can, and here's what he says, but if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Okay, so that's his thing. It's better for you to get married than to sit around and burn with passion. So if you're 38, and listen, this might be a principle that people don't want to talk about or dive into or something like that. But listen, I heard a pastor say, and I'll just throw it out there, whether you want to agree with it or not, that's fine. He says that he instructs some of his guys that are 35, 38 years old or something and still haven't found a wife. He said, you know what? If you really feel you're supposed to be married, you're supposed to have kids, if she's breathing and a Christian, go marry her. Like, stop, because usually some of the problem is you're just too picky. Like, you think everything has to be, and it's a heart issue. You need to check your heart over that. So again, not a blanket statement, but why don't we sometimes? Because we're looking for all the right things to be in place. We're looking for this person who's going to come in and a knight in shining armor, or the princess to rescue, or whatever it is. All these things. She's got to be blonde and 5'7" and fitness model and whatever, or he's got to be tall, dark, and handsome, or whatever. And listen, a lot of those things aren't even none of them are what God puts emphasis on. It's on the hidden person of the heart. It's on the condition, is this person seeking the Lord? And marriage, truthfully, is more about being the right person than finding the right person. That's what you see in Scripture. And somebody says, well, God's got this certain person for me and everything like that. Yeah, he's going to work it out. He works all things out together for good for those who love him. Remember that. Sometimes you just might need to evaluate and look at your life and go, have I been too picky here? Is this some kind of a personal preference thing that's holding me back? Am I looking for all the stars to align and all these things? Or am I concerned with being the right person? And then, and finding that person that comes along that you can go serve the Lord together and you can have a family and everything. So just some things to think about. In verse 10, he says, now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. So he says, this is from the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. and a husband is not to divorce his wife. So he makes a solid statement here, which is consistent throughout all the Bible. The Bible says God hates divorce. God says, if you come together now to the married, I'm going to tell you, a wife is not to leave her husband. And he says, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And so there's other places in the Bible we're going to say, and I'm going to go through the rest of this because he continues to build on it. But he says, so if the wife does leave, she should either not get married again or try to reconcile with her husband. And the husband is not to divorce his wife. It's both ends. It's, because a lot of times they would say in this time period, they say, well, the wife can't leave, but it's okay if the husband can leave. The Pharisees even taught that. The Pharisees made all these lists that say it's okay to divorce your wife. That's why, if you remember when they asked Jesus, when can a husband divorce from a wife? Jesus does give an exception there, and some people call it the exception clause or whatever. He says, in cases of adultery, that there can be forgiveness over that kind of thing, that it's okay for a person to divorce in cases of adultery. He said, but the only reason there was that concession was because the hardness of your heart. So he even put a clause on that it doesn't have to happen because of adultery, but if your heart is hardened because of that, I gave you an exception that you can do that. So some people will even say, listen, it's wrong to divorce in every case because God said it's only because of the hardness of your heart to divorce. Man, there's a legitimate case that you could make for that. There's also the case, though, that says, well, he did give the concession. Whether it was because of the hardness of your hearts or not, he did still give the concession. So if you divorce, though, it does say, truthfully, the best way to do it is you should remain unmarried. You should, because you were joined with that person. Remember the commitment you made. That's what this all comes back to. Remember the commitment. And does this open up a can of worms of all different kind of scenarios and all different kind of things? Yes, it does. Probably too deep for what we could talk about here. If you want to go, and I'll just throw this out there, if you ever want to talk about that stuff, maybe we'll take a time and talk about that, because it's stuff I've even wrestled with, thinking of scenarios I was going to have to come into contact with as a pastor of divorce and remarriage, and when it can, and somebody who's Christians when they divorce, or one's the Christian, one's not, and something happens, or both are not and get divorced, and then they become Christians, and then they want to so there's all these scenarios we can talk through that, man, really, like I always say, sin complicates things. Let's go back to the original design. Let's seek the Lord, and let's do it right and do it once. Let's do it right and do it once. Let's make a commitment. Let's stick to it. Let's have a covenant. And listen, you want to know why? This might sound very elementary. Want to know why we continue to have a good marriage? And sure, of course, every marriage has rocks and bumps and all this kind of stuff. But you know why we have a good marriage? Because neither of us are looking for another one. I'm not in a spot where if Kelly does something wrong, or she, doesn't meet one of my expectations, where I'm like, well, I'll just go get the girl down the street. Like, that doesn't even cross my mind. You know what I mean? I'm not out looking for something else. I'm not sitting online, looking at the next best thing that I can come replace the model with or whatever. That's part of the puzzle here. Is we made a commitment. We made a covenant before God, and we honor that. We value that. We're not looking for other options. We're not looking for other things. We're making this one work. We're working through the issues we need to work through. We're individually and together seeking the Lord. So continuing on, he goes, but to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, here's some wisdom. If any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she's willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the believing wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if an unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. But God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? So here he starts to talk about some of those issues. Let's throw out some scenarios. What if you guys are unbelievers when you get married? One of you becomes a Christian, and you start going, oh my gosh, we're unequally yoked. We're not on the same page anymore. I'm seeking the Lord, and my husband doesn't even want me to talk about God. You know, every time I bring it up, he gets all grumpy and nasty or whatever. Man, I guess God would probably just want me to leave it. It's an easy thing to think. Well, God would just probably, I'd be happier somewhere else. God wants me to be happy. And I've had Christians come to me and say, I just can't live with this one. God wants me to be happy. That's how they justify their divorce. And I said, listen, dude, that's not justified by God's actually concerned with a little more than your happiness. I hate to burst your bubble, but there's actually a little bit more that he's concerned with than your happiness. That's a shocking revelation to some people. But what does he say here? He goes, here's what you don't understand. If your husband's willing to still be with you, even though he's an unbeliever, he might get tired of hearing about Jesus or whatever. He says you're sanctifying your husband. It doesn't mean you're getting him saved. It doesn't mean he's being saved by you being there, that just because you guys are married, you're saved, he's not, that he's going to enter heaven. It's not that kind of a sanctification. But what it is he now has a constant light in his life. And if you guys have children, what it says is that your children have constant light in their life because you're there. And you need to stay there for their sakes. You need to put your wants and your needs and your sometimes even unmet feelings aside for the sake of your husband or your children. This is tough, but this is what it's saying. Even if you're getting treated wrong because of this, you need to then pull upon the promises of the Bible that God will never leave you or forsake you in your trials. That blessed are you when you suffer persecution, even if that persecution comes from your husband, because you're a Christian and he's not. Because your very presence in that household is sanctifying that household. It's making it holy. It's being a light to someone who, if he's still willing to be there, you're called to be that light. You're called to be and model Jesus for that man and your children. Vice versa. You're a husband who's saved and the wife's. And listen, you might even be two Christians that get that you guys, before you're married, you believe you're saved, you think everything's good. You get married and you start realizing as a woman, oh boy, this guy's not saved. I thought this guy was a great Christian. We got married. He might not even be a Christian. He doesn't read his Bible. He's not seeking the Lord. He's not anything of who I thought he was. What do I do? Or a man gets married to a woman. They get in a relationship and go, holy cow, this woman might not be saved. What do I do? You model Christ for her. You be Christ. You sanctify that household. Woman, your guy won't lead, family worship or read the Bible with your kids. You read the Bible with your kids. You ask your husband to do it, and if he won't do it, you say, well, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it. And you don't step on his toes and overthrow his boundaries or make him feel like less a man or whatever. You give him the opportunity, but you be Christ in that household. You be a light. And every scenario is going to be different, but you need to make sure, thank you, buddy. I think mommy wants some. You need to understand that becomes your role. Your role as the Christian in that relationship is not to leave, is not to abandon the situation, is not to go think you need to pursue happiness with a Christian man where everything's perfect. Paul says, if they're willing to live with you, if they're willing to stay with you, you figure it out. And sometimes, listen, I've heard stories, and this might stretch you. I've heard stories of men and women for years getting literally persecuted by their spouse, treated poorly because they were Christians, treated poorly every time they woke up to go to church, treated poor. I've even heard stories of abuse where they said, you know what? I'm getting abused. This is wrong. I have every earthly right to get out of this situation, but I've made a pact to this person. And because Christ forgives me every day, I'm going to continue to forgive this person. And I'm going to stand strong. And listen, I don't even know what that strength is like. That is strength that is not of this world, and it's purely of Jesus. But I'm telling you, it's been done. I've seen people. I've heard stories. And you know what else I've heard stories on the back end of that? 30, 40, 50 years down the road, the kids go, oh my gosh, I used to think mom was crazy, but she led me to the Lord. That was the only time I saw the true love of Jesus, and I knew it was real. I've heard spouses on their deathbed, the husband breaking down in tears, going, I get it now. I didn't understand. I know what Jesus is like. I want that. Even on their deathbed or whatever it is, or 10 years down the road going, I just didn't understand. I didn't know. I'm so sorry, whatever it is. And listen, truthfully, that takes a love that is Christ's love. We can't do that in our earthly power, but that's what Paul commends us to do. I'm not saying something like that's easy, but I am saying if you feel like, I think biblically it's something we should consider. I think it's something we should weigh in our hearts rather than tuck in tail and run very quickly, or being easy to just jump ship or go somewhere else. We might want to consider, does Christ want me here? Even in persecution. Listen, there are missionaries that get persecuted every single day, and every day standing up for their faith is something that flies in their face and whatever. And you think, man, in my own home, I shouldn't have to deal with this. No, you shouldn't, but you might be called to it. And you might want to consider that. Listen, as I'll take this maybe a different step. You could be a saved child in an unbelieving household, and you're called to submit to your parents and to be Christ to them and to honor them regardless of how they treat you, regardless of what's going on in there, and to love them and respect them. And that's the best way you can shine light in there. And you might think, well, the best scenario for me is to get out of here. Maybe the best scenario for you in light of the gospel is to stay. And I know you can twist this and say, well, Adam wants me being abused and Adam wants, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that every situation's different. I'm just saying, have you ever thought of some of these things? Have you ever thought this through? That Christ, if we are to love each other as Christ loved us, there's truthfully a lot more that he bore than sometimes we're willing to bear. And if he's still willing to forgive, and if he's still willing to give grace and mercy to us individually every day, and we're called to love and forgive the way he loves and forgives, man, there might be some things we need to overlook, or we need to forgive, or we need to give grace to. That's why I said earlier, wife or husband, it's not your job to punish your, does Christ punish you for your wrongdoings and your sin? Is he constantly withholding from you because you're drawing away or you're doing something wrong? No, to the contrary, he's constantly beckoning you to come near. He's constantly forgiving. He's constantly, and that's why the picture in the Old Testament, God gave a picture to the prophet Hosea in the Old Testament. He had to marry a prostitute. And Gomer committed adultery over and over and over again to Hosea. And Hosea would seek God and say, what are you doing, God? Why are you having me do this? I love this woman. And God said, this is our relationship. God said, I want to give you a picture, O Israel, of what you are to me. I love you unconditionally. I always accept you back. I bought you. He even had Hosea at one point. Gomer goes and cheats on him. She gets sold as a sex slave. And God tells Hosea, go buy her back. He goes, she's been cheating on me. She was a sex slave. She went and prostituted herself. And God said, go buy her back. That's how much I love you. And he gave him a picture of God's love. Dude, that's tough. But that's what it seems we're called to. And so we need to remember that as we think about these things in the marriage bed, as we think about these things in the marriage relationship, with sex, with just life in general, together with somebody. How quick are we to forgive to the ones we're committed to the ones who we're bound to? How quick are we to let love cover the multitude of sins? And again, not that it's always right, and there aren't things that we should deal with, and there aren't things that, listen, God deals with us over these things too. It's not just this blank check or whatever. But we should look to Christ as our example. We should look to Christ for our relationships of how we should be mutually submissive. Christ was submissive to the church that he gave himself for her. And in turn, the church is to be submitted to Christ, to follow him. In the same way, we are to be submitted to our husbands and our wives mutually, giving ourselves for one another, thinking of their needs before our own, thinking of their pursuits and passions and dreams and whatever it is before our own, even sometimes, thinking of their benefit and their sanctification, thinking of how they could benefit from us, not being quick to run away, not being quick to condemn, not being quick to try and just get out of it or jump to the next thing. No, being committed, having our word actually mean something. So does that, any kind of questions over that? That's marriage. That's marriage, truthfully. Again, it's more about being the right person than it is finding the right person. I believe when you focus on being the right person, you'll find that you have the right person. When you both are focused on those things. That's the ideal scenario. God at the center, man and woman, pursuing mutually submissive, seeking Christ over it. That's going to be the best case scenario. When there's stuff in the world and you got one person up, one person down, whatever it is, then you need to be seeking the Lord over those things, of how to have wisdom in dealing with those situations and how to be seeking God through that, and how you can help that spouse in the midst of those situations. Cool. I'm not going to continue on. We'll go on with that next week, so it might kind of extend it. But that's the end of the whole sex stuff and everything. But any kind of questions with that stuff? Any scenarios? Any? Yeah. It's one of my that's the when I really dove into that book in the Old Testament, it rocked me. That book rocked me because I was like, at the time I was like, I do not know love like this. I don't know love that you're wronged every second of every day, yet you give grace. And yet that's God's love. When have we ever showed him the affection and desire that he deserves? Yet how much does he lavish grace upon us? Like, that's an insane thing, to sit and ponder. Like, that's stuff you should sit alone with and go, wow, God, you're awesome. Like, you're amazing. So, Father, we just we thank you for this time in your word, God, and we just